All right, so I think we'll be ready to start. Again, everything will be recorded and available afterward. For people that are watching after, thank you for taking the time to watch the recording. You can reach out to my colleague or myself afterward for any question. So for today's presentation, we'll start with really look at the context of supply chain, some of the observation and the big trend that we've seen. After that, we'll look at the most common problem observed. Some of them will even present some solution, and it will be supported by new technologies and recommendation to fix those problems. We'll look at the best way to implement some of those solutions. We have a great success story that covers some of the key points covered in today's presentation, and we'll finish with a quick recap. As Nicolas mentioned, you can put your question in the chat throughout the presentation or reach out afterward, and we'll make everything we can to answer those questions. So for those of you who are not familiar with me, I'm the CEO and co-founder of Axya. I have a mechanical engineering background, and I also studied anthropology, society, and communication, so super relevant for supply chain management. And when I worked at Bombardier, I was in charge of supplier quality. And throughout that experience and the last year of working, I've built some expertise in supply chain. I work with companies in different vertical, but also manage thousands of requests for quotation, supported by even more quotes. And in the last year, I really built some relationship with various numbers of suppliers across North America, also in Europe, and I've studied the best practice in supply chain. So I'll be sharing some of the observation we made with some of the largest companies, but also we've observed in the industry. And I'll let my colleague Nicolas present himself.
So hi everyone, my name is Nicolas Gauthier. I'm one of the co-founder at Axya, and I'm in charge of business development. So previously, before starting Axya, I worked in the manufacturing industry. I studied in either Cégep in Quebec or university as well in mechanical engineering. And I've been lucky to work at Pratt & Whitney Canada, where I saw the problem firsthand with issues regarding how we manage supply chain, mostly with email, spreadsheet, and so on. And afterwards, I've worked also in different various jobs in the manufacturing industry, mostly as a CNC operator back prior to my college degree. And since I started Axya, I've had the chance to make many visits in many machine shops across Quebec and even some in Ontario. So I'll be glad to be assisting to the webinar today. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out afterward as well.
Thank you, Nicolas. So we'll take a step back and look at the sourcing behavior. This is the Kraljic Matrix. It's really to look at the different type of sourcing activity. They're spread in 4 big categories and evaluated across 2 different vertical, 2 different axes. The first one is the profit impact. So how does it impact the bottom line? How much does it cost, and what are the potential saving in those areas? The other one is really the risk. Some of those components might have a low price, but can have a big impact on the operations. And today we'll be really focusing on leverage items and bottleneck items. Strategic item is really when you have key product to source, you can build relationship and have 10-year contract with your partners. Usually there's not a lot of changes over time in those items. And in non-critical item, we're talking about pen and papers, gloves, and some elements that are easy and simple to source. If we look at the leverage item, it's really when you have high volume of those activity to source, they can impact the profit. And among the best way to manage this, you want to create an healthy competition environment by having multiple potential partners for those sourcing activities. You want to standardize the type of parts and items that you source. There are some industry standards. If you look at nuts and bolts, you have the best practice, minimizing the type of parts that you source, increase your leverageability. And if in your organization you have multiple business units, best practice is really to coordinate and centralize those sourcing activity. The other area that we will be looking at today is really the bottlenecks. So here we're talking about technical component, but doesn't necessarily have a high price point. For example, a critical bracket in a big assembly, the part might be worth $50, $200, or $500, which is really small compared to the full assembly. But if you miss that part, you're not able to deliver the finished product, so it has a big impact on your supply chain. So one good way to optimize this type of sourcing is really to have continuity of supply, work with multiple potential suppliers, and to do that, you need to have really good understanding of the market, who's available and who has what type of expertise. You can put in place a medium-term contract in terms of like availability of the supplier, type of performance that you're expecting. So to structure that type of relationship, but having an ongoing process to evaluate the specific requirement that you have is another great way to minimize the dependency and the risk associated. If you want to do those two things well, it's really important to build a relationship with your partners and your suppliers. So this is something that will be repeated throughout the presentation, but we believe that with the right technology, you can have a healthy and sustainable relationship with your partners. Look at the sourcing trend. I split them in three big categories. The first one, if we look at the way the supplier perform and manufacture the good, one big trend is the hyper specialization. What this allowed them to do is to be hyper competitive in specific type of production. For example, CNC machine of titanium with high tolerance, a small tolerance and high precision. So to do that, they will acquire the right equipment and make sure that they build the expertise internally. What it does is that they can have a really low price point for their clients while keeping a high margin, so those companies become really effective. Another trend that we started to see to respond to the COVID challenges is really to increase inventory. It's completely opposed to the just-in-time that we've seen, and it's actually caused the just-in-case. Nicolas can share in the chat a link to an article that we read, and it's quite relevant, that talks about those trends. But really here, the objective is the way of changing the way we source with the supplier. The second one that we've seen is an increase and a rise in the supply chain complexity, especially when companies used to do complex offshoring. And we look at the most frequent problem. And the first one is difficulty in communication. Sometimes your partner are not on the same time zone and don't use the same language. So it becomes really difficult to identify problems and fix them quickly. The second one is the long lead time. If the goods that you're sourcing are heavy, it's usually shipped by ship. Sometimes there's a combination of transportation medium, but it leads to longer lead time. And to tackle the long lead time, you really work with larger orders. So in a context where you need to be super agile, it becomes more difficult. The last one is when we look at ESG and governance, it's the context of labor shortage. So having lack of potential employees and type of job that are not really attractive for them. So high turnover, a lot of position to fill. And the other one is the scope 3 of greenhouse gas emission, GHG. So it's companies are starting to look at the emission of their whole supply chain and the partner that they work with. Because of that, the new way of sourcing have changed. The best practice are different. And this is what we'll talk about today. So really, in order to support those changes in the way to operate, becomes really important to maintain up-to-date database about your core activity, your suppliers, and even the market at large. The second one is to make sure that you're able to increase your optionality and be agile in the process to be able to have multiple vendors for a specific type of sourcing, to avoid long lead time and really big problems like we've seen in the last year. As I mentioned, it's important to focus on building relationship with your partners. They are an expert in what they do and they can solve a lot of your problems if you work with them beforehand, which is the last point of working with leading indicator, having conversation before the activity happen to make sure that you can predict what will happen. Currently, we see a lot of companies working with only lagging indicators. So have I received the part on time? It's important to know this, but if it's too late, it's too late. And then you need to get into problem solving that is more costly and more problematic. So we'll do a step back and really look at the process of sourcing and the problems that comes with it. Again, don't hesitate to put question in the chat or add some personal experience if you think it's relevant with what we're talking about. But we'll look at the sourcing process. And here we took a typical sourcing activity. Here in this case, you have parts that needs to be parts or item that needs to be sourced with potential partners that can do this. Either it's custom or highly specific, and it fit into the category of bottleneck or leverage items. So if we start from the left, the request is generated internally, either by your sales team, operation, engineering. So at that point, you have a list of items or parts to source with specific characteristic. This is then identified by the sourcing specialist, who will take a decision of who they should be inviting in their bidding process. That information is then usually managed by emails. Some of them use other technology, but in the most common case, you send an email, you have attached files that are analyzed by the supplier. Then we get into the bidding process, where the supplier will look at the requirement, do internal analysis to come up with price, lead time, different options. This is sent back to the buyer or the sourcing specialist. At that point, there's a lot of back and forth. And once we get all the information, and if we get all the information on time, we run the analysis. So we consolidate all the information in one place. We look at the different options and select the supplier. And from there, we can create the request for quotation, the PO, the purchase order. As we can see, there's multiple tools that are used, multiple steps, and a lot of work associated with this. So in terms of big problems and the impact observed, the first one is really a lot of time is spent on the low value tasks. There's a lot of employee fatigue associated with this, and it's not the best use of their time, so there's loss of productivity. Second one is really to look at the procurement activity in real time. What are the different options? Gathering that information. The information is limited, so it'll lead to missed opportunity, not taking the best decision. There's a big cost associated with this. And the last one is when you want to work with your suppliers and make sure you get the good price and the right lead time. If you work with small network of suppliers, it's difficult. The other option is to target a lot of suppliers, but then it creates supplier fatigue because they don't win at a high conversion rate. So we simplify those process and really cover them in 4 steps that we'll be looking at today in the portion of the webinar. The first problem is really working with outdated supplier information. Either information is gathering with the wrong tools, but it limits the ability to do proper sourcing activity. The second big problem that we see is the suboptimal targeting, so not targeting the right partners or a small list of potential partners, which doesn't lead to optimal prices and delays. The third one, because it's a highly manual workflow, we are not able to spend enough time with the suppliers, even problem solving, negotiation, innovation, but really working with them. And the last one is the poor tracking of the KPI, mostly a lagging indicator. But those are the 4 big categories of problem we'll be tackling today. Currently, the way the companies are able to navigate in that environment is that either they have a senior individual that knows the supply chain properly, have a lot of experience, so they're able to navigate that difficult environment. But when we talk about junior purchasing specialists, it becomes really difficult. Talking about those junior individuals working in a context where the tool stack is still email, a spreadsheet, created a lot of turnover. It's a big trend that we've seen. And finally, because of the lack of visibility on what's happening, it becomes really hard to predict the problem beforehand and take actions earlier in the process. All of that lead to companies working not with the ideal supplier. And in terms of impact on the company, it leads to higher price, longer lead time. Sometimes we even have quality issues. And overall, it's just not the optimal way of working with the partner. It's important to mention here that on the other side, the suppliers also might have a hard time. When a supplier is late, there's penalties. So neither the buyer or the suppliers are in a win-win situation. So now we'll start to look at the solutions. I split it in what is the ideal goal, and then each of the big problems and how we can tackle them. So a good outcome for sourcing process is really to put in place the infrastructure, the process, and the technology to leverage this. It's an opportunity to have a big impact on the operation. So if you reduce your cost, shorten your lead time, you have higher margin, and your supplier also benefiting from this. To do that, you need to work with the right supplier and optimize condition over time. Previously, there was some trend in the manufacturing where buyers could put a lot of pressure on the supplier to reduce the margin, but this led to some of the supplier going bankrupt. And at the end of the day, the buyer is losing, the supplier is losing, and the ecosystem is not performing properly. So you want to find the right supplier, and the right supplier is someone that you can trust. You've worked with in the past, you have enough information about the expertise. This usually leads to higher quality, would minimize the problem afterward. If the supplier built the right equipment, they have expertise in this process, they can provide a really good price with healthy margin, which again is important if you want to look at it on a longer time frame. You want your supplier to have good business, be healthy, and be able to grow, and you want to get the best price and delays for this. The final one is you want a supplier to be available. So we'll look at this afterward, but today's best supplier not might be the right supplier in 3 to 6 months, either because they're overwhelmed or because their equipment is not evolving as fast as you'd like. So you want to make sure you understand what is their equipment, what are their availability. And if you do that properly, you're able to work with the right supplier, build a strong relationship, and make sure that you have the right data to support those decisions. So as I mentioned, I split it in 4 big categories. If we look at the diagram on the left, we'll start before you launch a request. Before you start to source with your suppliers, you want to have the right data. So properly managing it, gathering the key information. After that, we'll look at the beginning of the process, which is when you target your supplier, who are the right potential partners? How do you engage with them? And then we move into managing the request. So gathering that information and making sure that your team is focusing on high impact tasks, mainly working with your suppliers. The final one is really the reporting and the tracking. And this is a loop because once you finish the process, you have new information that should be leveraged in future sourcing activities. So the first one is before the sourcing in terms of data management. We see a lot of setup where a request is launched and there's missing information. This means that the process needs to be stopped. You need to get that information. The supplier is wasting time. You're not getting the quote on time, so it'll lead to longer delays. Also, if you have a limited understanding on the requirements, so is it a CNC machine part? Is it 3-axis, 5-axis, high precision, low precision? Those elements need to be taken into consideration because it's not the same partner that will be the best one depending on the type of request that you have. As I mentioned, finding the right partner requires updated information. So we see a lot of customers update their database on a yearly basis, even less than that. And when you're in a time of need and you need to move fast, if you work with outdated information, there's big delays. The final one is not being aware of the supplier workload. So a supplier that is completely overwhelmed will either not bid or bid with the premium and the cost. And again, it's not a win-win situation. Tealbook, a company that focuses on supplier data, made a research with thousands of experts in the industry, and they estimate that 41% of procurement executives will lose business opportunity because of bad supplier information. So really managing that database, making sure it's up to date is important. So in terms of a good setup, you want all the information of your request to be available. So before you launch a request, do I have my 2D drawings, 3D model? Is there a specific requirement that will be required for the supplier to give a good quote? So making sure that information is available beforehand, you can work with standards, you can have a process in place, but this will save you time in the long run. Properly understanding what are the requirements. As I mentioned, is it a 3-axis or a 5-axis? Is it high tolerance? Is there a specific requirement for this? Is required because after that, you won't be targeting the same potential partners. And making sure that your supplier's information is up to date and you talk with your supplier to understand what is their current workload, but also what type of requests they want to be invited on. So in terms of strategy and best practice, having a standard validation process before launching the request will lead to time saving. And if you're able to loop in a technical person from your team, either engineering or even the salesperson, it will allow them to answer future questions. So making sure that you have the right people in the process and all the information. The second one is quarterly review with your key suppliers. The majority of manufacturing companies have a large approved supplier list, but the majority of their activity are centralized in 5, 10, 20 suppliers. So making sure you have ongoing conversation with them, where the objective of the conversation is really talk about previous performance, short-term objective on your side and on their side, and really looking at the long-term vision of that relationship between the two parties. In terms of technology to support the data management, If you want to work with a simple tech stack, you can just make sure you update your supplier database. Excel spreadsheet is a good system for this. There are some ERP also. If you have an ERP, there are some ERP that structure that information and make it useful afterward. We really recommend looking at this and identifying how you can keep that database up to date. If you want to move into more advanced technology, there are some companies that focus on dynamic supplier database. It's updated in real time, either by you or by other technologies, and you want to enrich the supplier set. So there's Steelbook that we just quoted, Scalbee, Matchery. And if it's a specific problem that you have, don't hesitate to reach out afterward. Depending on what you're looking for, some of those companies could directly answer your needs. Now, the second portion of the process is once you have gathered all that information, you understand what is the type of part or item that you need to source, you need to look at who you should be targeting. One of the standard process that I've seen personally across multiple industry, and it's not only by the size of the company, it's really in terms of process, some big companies will target a single supplier. The main reason is because the person in charge of the sourcing activity doesn't know better than this. They need to get the part or the project quickly, so they call one supplier and they get a price. This is really unstructured and it doesn't lead to optimal prices and delays. The second thing that we see is we see a low number of supplier targeted, either because there's not awareness of who could be working on this, but if you target 2 to 3 suppliers, 50% of them answer, then you're stuck with 1 or 2 response, and it becomes really difficult to fit the need of your organization. Another problem that we see is a poor matching between the request and the supplier expertise. So if the supplier doesn't have the technology to do what you're looking for example, a 5-axis or a post-treatment process, the supplier is wasting their time looking at your request and they're not providing a bid. So you expect a bid from them, they waste their time. It's a poor matching. No one is winning in this case. The last one is really standard process and documentation. So sometimes the request for quotation will be in an email, in an Excel, there's a PDF, there's a big variety of type of way of asking for the price, which create frustration on the supplier side, but also a lot more work afterward when you need to consolidate that information. In terms of good setup and best practice, identifying 3 to 5 highly qualified suppliers to do the job, and making sure that you get the proper response. This will lead to having multiple options. Sometimes the lead time will be more critical. Others will be the minimum order quantity or even just the price, but you want to have multiple options to work with this. After that, it's really targeting the right supplier. So you want to look at, as I mentioned, the matching between the type of request and the expertise. Really simple example could be a good supplier in high precision machining doesn't want to do order of over 1,000 parts. They could do it, but that's not what they're set up for. So if you target them, they will bid, but the price won't be really good. And even on their side, they're not set up to do that job. So if they win it, it's not in their core expertise, could lead to problems, and it's not optimal. Another element to take into consideration is the availability. So if you have proper conversation with your supplier, you know what to expect over the next quarter, over the next 6 months. You understand that they're looking for a specific type of job that will fit their need. They will have availability for this. But if you go outside of that, it will take longer for them to produce the goods and longer for you to receive the goods. Final one is really to standardize the process. So have a specific list of suppliers that you can be targeting. Have the documentation. You can provide the Excel spreadsheet where they bid, or you fit your setup with what they're doing to really reduce the variability of type of work in each of the requests. In terms of the best practice, what I've seen with the good sourcing process is you have subgroup of suppliers and you review them. So for example, it could be prototyping, CNC machine, 5-axis. Which suppliers are good in this? And you want to involve them in the conversation. You want to talk with your supplier and be like, what type of job are you looking for? Are you really good at this? I'll invite you on the future request for this. Also, using the different subgroup and the type of request to match them properly seems obvious, but doing that has massive impact on the cost of the goods afterward. And finally, do regular exercise of doing supplier discovery because your need might be changing. So you're shifting from R&D phase to maybe more higher production. Your partners to do that are not the same as they were before. So you want to understand who's available in the market, who could be a good partner in this. And you want to do that especially if the engagement on your request is dropping. We have a great example in today's webinar about how to fix this, but having the right suppliers available become key. If we look at the standard way of doing this with basic technology, one of the best practices is a centralized email box for the sourcing activity. What this does is sometimes one of the sourcing specialists will need to leave and a colleague can take the workload from there. If you work with centralized email, you can have a pre-list of supplier to invite, you can have some templates in it, and the supplier list need to be available for all the teams. So a shared Excel or a Google Sheet are really good ways to make sure that information is updated. In terms of solution for this, there's ERP integration with SAP Ariba. It's called a source to pay, so you can source your suppliers up to manage the payment. Jagger is another one, Coupa. Those are big systems that allow you to have a high level of detail in the sourcing process. So if you really want to move forward in the proper targeting and the management of the RFQ, those solutions can provide some value. And now we'll move into the management of the request. So during the sourcing activity, at that point, you have invited your suppliers. They are in the process of bidding, and you want to communicate with them the right way. So in terms of bad setup, what I've seen is teams that spend the majority of their time in follow-ups. So they call the supplier, will I get my bid on time? One of the reasons this happened is because they're used to having a lot of delay between launching the request and selecting the supplier, that they on purpose put a due date sooner, which create problem on the supplier side, and you end up spending a lot of your time making follow-up. A good example would be the end date of the RFQ process is Friday, 5 p.m. No one is awarding a contract at Friday on 5 p.m. So you put pressure on your supplier side. Some of them would be able to provide the quote on Monday morning or even throughout the weekend. But by adding that extra pressure, it doesn't lead to the engagement that you need. Another portion of the time that requires a lot of time is the consolidating of the data. So if you receive some quotes on PDF, other quotes on Excel spreadsheet, or even in the email, a human need to spend time gathering that information, copy paste it. Sometimes there's a mistake associated with this, and it doesn't create a lot of value. Another one is that you work with lagging indicators. So what you look at is Friday, 5 p.m., what quote were there? Whoop, I'm missing a few one. I need to go and follow up and adapt the sourcing process. So you really work once the thing happened and you try to avoid problems. And for all those reasons, not enough time is spent with the suppliers. So as I mentioned, they are your partners. You want to work with them. You want to review the quoting process. You want to answer some of their questions and make sure that they have a good understanding of what you're trying to do. But if you spend all your time doing follow-ups, consolidating data, there's no time spent with your partners. In terms of ideal setup, what you want to know is if your supplier will bid. So that can be achieved by educating them, telling what are your expectations, but as soon as you know who's going to quote when, you can adapt the rest of the process. You want to spend time analyzing the data and not consolidating it because gathering the information can lead to mistakes, but also doesn't create value. You create value when you look at your options. And once again, you work with your supplier with those different options. Maybe it could be take a batch and split it into 2 deliveries so you can have your first production on time. This is really the last point. You have the conversation with your supplier. Maybe one of them will recommend using a different paint, so it could lead to a cheaper price, or be able to deliver on time with the different requirement. It's not possible. So that's really where you have the biggest impact with your partners. And to do that, properly communicating the expectation to your supplier. So I need that quote on that time because I placed my order on that time. If this is coherent, the supplier can adapt and even recommend different things. Hey, I won't be able to quote by Friday, but on Monday morning, I'll be able to give you a quote. Is it good for you? So you want to have that back and forth communication. You want to standardize as much as possible the work and automate the low value task. Follow-ups, consolidating the data. This is not creating value, but it needs to be done. And finally, if you do the first 2 steps properly, you'll have more time to really work with your supplier and do some problem solving, improvement, and avoid some of the challenge that we mentioned. In terms of technology, similar to what I explained on the previous point, but the source to pay are system built to streamline that information. They offer some automation, they offer some data consolidation. So basically your team can really focus on building the relationship with your partners. If you don't want to move into those complex systems, a good thing to do with available standard technology would be to use quote templates, Excel macro for the analysis, do the copy paste and consolidate that in an environment. There are some low technology, low specificity ways of doing that, and it can save a lot of time. Last one is in terms of reporting and the tracking. So what we see in the poor setup is really limited amount of KPI in place. We hear a lot of companies say, yes, I'd like to do that, but we never set up neither a dashboard or a KPI. Some of them do set them up, but it's not properly updated. So if you know that the information is not regularly updated, you cannot trust it, so it doesn't become really efficient. The last one is really the lagging indicator, as I mentioned. So if you know that the part is late, the type of action that you can take is limited. So it's a setup that I've seen a lot. And again, not only in small companies, but bigger companies, it's almost a standard in sourcing. In terms of good setup, you want to have your KPIs set up, and the KPI can be at different level. You can look at the department, what are the objective. Individual, you look at your numbers of ongoing requests, but also you want to look at it on the supplier base. So to do that and to be reliable, you need to be automatically updated. And finally, you want to combine lagging indicator and leading indicator to really make sure you have the right information to take action earlier in the process. In terms of best practice, you look at the company's objective. So could be to increase production, could be to reduce lead time, increase margin. Depending on this, the KPI that you'll be setting are not the same, and you want to set them and evaluate them on an ongoing basis. So you want to review them and identify some action based on the KPI that you see. We have an example of how it can be done in the webinar. And finally, you want to involve your supplier in the process. What is important for you? Why are you looking at specific KPIs and how they can improve on this? In terms of technology, the basic way of operating is Excel spreadsheet and PowerPoint. It works. It's really good. It's manually uploaded, but at least you have visibility on the key information. If you want to move forward with something a little bit more advanced, there's some real-time tracking with Tableau, Power BI, where the information can be connected on an ERP, and you have real-time tracking, so it saves a lot of time. So really, if we summarize the best practice, you want to keep your database up to date, schedule time with your supplier to make sure you have the right information, and this is really the foundation for the other improvement. After that, you want to get 3 quotes. A good way to do that is to have 3 to 5 qualified suppliers invited to bid. This gives you multiple options, leads to better price, better lead times, while maintaining a healthy margin on the supplier side. After that, you look at communication channel. During the process, you want to make sure that you automate low-value tasks so you can focus on building a relationship with the supplier and fixing problems. And to support all of this, you want to have the proper KPI in place and have ongoing review of this. This will reduce risk, but also identify the different opportunities to support your strategic objectives. If we move into tips of how to implement this and how it can be done, the first one is really to identify which challenge you'll be working on. So I talked about the 4 steps. There's multiple things, each of those steps. So you want to look at which portion of the cycle can impact the way you operate. If you want to reduce risk, maybe it's the KPI that you want to set earlier. If you want to reduce cost, make sure you work with the right suppliers. Different segments of the cycle will impact different objectives that you have. So what you want to do is come up with a list of 5 to 10 challenges that you'll observe in your company, and after that, you want to prioritize them. Some of those challenges, you want to delay them, and yes, it could improve what you do, but no short-term impact or minimal impact. Some of them have high importance, and it's really critical to fix it, so you want to do it now. So out of the 5 to 10 objective or challenge, you'll have a short list of action that can be taken, prioritize. You start with the number 1, and what you want to do is an iterative process. If today you want to increase your supplier diversity and work with new potential partner, adding 1,000 suppliers to your approved supplier list will take too much time. You won't get the impact that you're looking for. You look at the problem, you build a quick solution that can impact it, you measure how it's done, you look at the deployment, and then you keep testing. And if you do multiple cycles, you'll reach a certain point of impact that fits your need. And from there, you can move from the first challenge or the first objective, move to the second one. And you do that on an ongoing basis. So really successful improvement comes from identifying the right problem. Based on the right problem, you identify a solution. So you analyze it, you gather the proper data to see if it's really hitting the objective as you expected, and you learn and you keep iterating with this. In terms of case study, this is a case where I was personally involved. In this situation, there was multiple things that we wanted to do. We wanted to minimize cost. There was a component of risk associated, but to really hit those two objectives, we needed new opportunities. So what we had was a sourcing process of critical component, not a high value, but they were critical for the sourcing, and we didn't get the right number of bids on those parts. So what we wanted to do is have multiple options to make sure we could have the lead time, the proper lead time with the specific quality. Have no compromise. So yes, the lead time are important, but if it comes at a premium, what can we do? And we wanted to remain agile. The problem that we observed, we had in place a system to collect the data about the supplier engagement. Our internal objective was to get 3 bids for each of the requests. What we noticed is that as we moved by the end of the year and the beginning of the year, the engagement rate of the supplier was reducing. The target was 3 bids per request, and in February we hit 2.9, which is below the target. But what was great is because we were tracking that information, we were able to see the decrease over time and put in place a strategy to avoid that situation. And we identified that one of the ways to do this was to add new qualified supplier. Another thing that we did is when we look at the reduced engagement, we could identify the supplier that used to bid on those requests and currently couldn't do it. Picked up the phone, talked with them, and we understood that they were overwhelmed for the upcoming 2 quarters, and we shouldn't expect a bid from them. And that proper communication allowed us reduce the pressure on them and them making sure they could focus on the right thing without impacting the business relationship. It was really a win-win situation. And by adding new suppliers that could complement the ability that we had, we were able to increase the engagement on the ongoing request. And from March moving forward in the rest of the year, we were above the target. So if we want to do similar things in other contexts, depending on the type of objective that you have, it's not the same solution that would be adapted. So if you want to look at cost reduction, you can work with new suppliers or with existing supplier and put in place new strategy. Supplier performance is always something you want to track because it impacts the long-term performance of your organization. Internally, you can want to track the different supplier engagement, the cycle time, and finally your procurement team, how it's behaving. So in terms of conclusion, I really want to do a summary of what was covered today. So the first one is the sourcing trend. We see successful company on the supply side increase their specialization, and on the buy side understand that properly to work with them in ideal setup. Another trend is the just in case, which is increasing inventory or supply availability to make sure that we're able to provide the good at the right rate. This is a response to the supply chain complexity increasing. Another good strategy is reshoring, working with suppliers that are really close because the problem identifier were change in communication, longer lead time, and big orders required to place the order. Final big trend that we see is really the labor shortage. Can you make sure that your employees are working in high impact jobs, that they enjoy what they do to minimize the turnover? But also another ESG important element is the scope 3. What are your supplier emissions? How can you track that and have a long-term vision to hit some of the objectives that we see in the industry, such as net zero emission by 2050? So in terms of changes, it's to response of the 4 problems that I mentioned. What's happening before you do the sourcing, once you do the targeting, when it's ongoing with the request, and how you track all that information. Unfortunately, we can't rely on a lot of senior individuals anymore. There's a labor shortage. You want to make sure your employees have a high impact job, and you want to detect the problem before they happen to make sure you work with the right supplier and don't pay more or have quality and lead time issue afterward. Best practice that we mentioned is really up-to-date information in your database, something that is frequently updated, or even technology that can do that for you. That type of data is the foundation of any type of improvement we want to do. After that, you want to do a healthy bidding process, working with the right suppliers at the right time and getting different options to make sure you remain agile and you have optionalities. A good way to make sure you get the proper number of bids is proper targeting, but also ongoing communication with your partners during the sourcing process and even during the production process. This will lead to shorter sourcing process, but also higher engagement. And the last one is to make sure that you track this afterward and it update your supplier database and your internal tracking system. There's a lot of new solution emerging in the market. You see supplier enrichment database, automation tools, smart targeting. All those new trends are coming to answer those specific needs. We will be part of a DPW Amsterdam at the end of the year where we talk about those new technology. It's in Europe, but if some of you can attend, there will be a lot of really exciting new market solution to the market challenge that we see. And if you have one thing to remember from today, it's really understand your supplier with the proper data and focus on strengthening the relationship with them. So that's all I had to present today. For those of you that attended online, you can ask questions. We'll remain on the call to discuss with you. Or if you were looking at the recording, you can reach out. You have our contact here, and we'll be more than happy to answer your questions.